Hello and welcome to another one of our Sunday night studies. I really enjoyed last week getting to talk about some of the myths that people might believe about us at Southside. And it kind of got me thinking about the fact that it would be fun to talk about some of the myths that are centered around the Bible. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at myths and legends of the New Testament. So I want us to start by making sure we understand what we mean when we're saying myths and legends. These are likely things that you have heard maybe preached or even taught before. You may not even know where you picked it up necessarily, but it's something that we have heard over and over and over so much that we've just come to assume that it's true, and we may not even realize that it's not actually based in biblical fact. I recently heard a story about how a ship in 1876 was sailing off the coast of Australia, and it went through some turbulent waters, and those on board looked out and they thought they saw something that looked like sand out there. And so they looked at their charts and they marked that location and they named it Sandy Island. Well, other map makers saw this island on their map and began including it in theirs. And over the years and over the decades, it just kept on being included. Well, as recently as 2012, if you looked on Google Maps between Australia and New Caledonia, you would have seen Sandy Island. One small problem: it didn't exist. In fact, a scientist who saw it and thought it was odd that this island would be out in such deep waters went out to investigate to see what kind of island it was and that sort of thing. And when he got to that spot on the map, there was nothing there. And so for more than 130 years, map makers had just assumed that it was there and no one had ever bothered to check. That is how myths and legends get started and how they persist for so long, because nobody ever actually checks the facts. Well, that's sort of what we're going to be doing with these videos. We're going to be checking the facts. We're going to be looking into some of the things that we've always heard or always seen and see whether or not they're actually true. Tonight, we're going to start with the very beginning of our Bibles, really, or of the New Testament, rather. We're going to begin with the birth of Jesus. Now, tell me if this sounds familiar. We three kings of Orient are, bearing gifts we traverse afar, field and fountain, moor and mountain, following yonder star. Now, even if you don't necessarily recognize the old Christmas song, We Three Kings, I'm sure that you have seen a manger scene before, right? Whether that is sitting out in somebody's yard or out in front of a church somewhere or a painting hanging on a wall, they all have basically the same focus, or they have the same elements. There's Jesus lying there in a manger. There's Mary and Joseph standing nearby. There's some livestock usually scattered around. And then what you have probably seen are these three guys standing there holding gifts that they have brought. Now, rather than kings, perhaps you've heard of the three wise men. So you know who those three guys are in that manger scene, but here's the thing. The manger scene with these three wise men is really based more in myth or legend than reality. First of all, it's because the timing is all off. You see, in Matthew chapter 2, we're told a couple of things that really indicate that the visit from these men did not take place on the night of Jesus' birth, or even the next night, or the next night, or the next night. Probably not any time close to his birth. Matthew just says that it was after Jesus was born. And then the text says that when the men arrived in Bethlehem, they entered a house and they found the child with his mother. Now notice that the text does not say that they found a baby like the shepherds found on the night of his birth. These guys found a child, and it's actually a word that is used for young children all the way up to the age of 7. The other thing that tells us a lot is the fact that when Herod discovers that these men had deceived him, or that they had not returned to tell him where the child was, he orders that all male children under the age of 2 be put to death. Now, why would he give that kind of order if his conversation with these wise men had in any way given him the impression that they had come to see a baby rather than a child? So, the first part of this legendary image that we know is not likely to be true is the fact that it happened anywhere close to Jesus' birth. But next, it doesn't seem very likely that there would have been just 3 of them. The Bible actually doesn't tell us how many there were. We're just told that there were 3 types of gifts that were being given: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The reality is that if they were to travel much of a distance from the east to get to Bethlehem, as these men did, with these valuable gifts in tow, it would have been pretty unwise for them to travel in just a group of 3, because they would have been very susceptible to bandits and robbers. Now, it's possible that they had traveled with a group of guards or servants or something along those lines, but the reality is that there could have just as easily been 10 or 15 or 20 as 3. The bottom line is we really just don't know. And then lastly, regardless of how many there were, one of the more difficult questions to answer is, who are they? Are they kings, like the song says? Well, no, because they're never described in that way in Scripture. But most of our English texts use the phrase wise men. But that's kind of vague, isn't it? That doesn't really tell us a lot about them. The word used by Matthew, though, is actually magoi, or magi. Now, at this point in history, that is a word that would have referred to non-Jewish men who were experts at things like reading the stars, interpreting dreams, and that sort of stuff. In fact, that's pretty much what they tell Herod when they arrive in Jerusalem. They followed the stars to come and see this child who was going to be the king of the Jews. Now, the fact that they came from the east, and considering the types of gifts they brought, and the fact that they knew who the Jews were at all, should tell us that they probably came from somewhere like the area around Babylon or somewhere on the Arabian Peninsula. Now, that's certainly not what we would call the Orient, the Far East. So here's what we do know for sure. Probably several months after Jesus had been born, a group of magi from east of Israel came to visit Jesus. That's not quite the manger scene that we're accustomed to seeing, is it? But really, before we wrap up tonight, I want us to notice an important part of what Matthew tells us. Because how many of these men there were, or where exactly they were from, or when exactly they came, is not at all what Matthew is focused on. Those are all secondary details, as evidenced by the fact that he really doesn't give us those details. Instead, Matthew really wants us to pay attention to why these men are there. They were not there just to visit. They were not there just to see something special. In Matthew chapter 2 and verse 2, what they tell Herod is, "We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Now, to anyone who was reading this for the first time, to any Jew who was reading this, as was likely Matthew's primary audience, that would have been astounding. These non-Jewish men traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles to worship this child. It kind of reminds me of something that I saw when I was in Honduras. I was there and we were taking food out to families that needed food, and they took us to this one elderly couple's home, and it was way, way out in the jungle. In fact, it was so far out that you couldn't drive there. You had to drive to a certain point and then get out and hike up the mountainside. Well, we get there and we're visiting with them, and then one of the things that I found out while we were there was that this older couple traveled 2 hours each direction every Sunday to get to worship. And we're standing there outside their house, and I look out, and I can actually see the path that they would take as this footpath winds its way across the ridge of the mountainside and on down. And I thought, man, I can't believe that at their age, they're willing to make that kind of journey on foot to worship God. When I meet people like that, and when I hear about these magi in Matthew chapter 2 that traveled so far to see Jesus, it just reminds me of how precious worship really is. It helps me to remember just how special every opportunity I have to worship God really is. And I hope that tonight's study can do the same for you. I hope that we will never take for granted our opportunities to worship God. So with that in mind, I hope that you will have a blessed evening and a blessed week, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.